Welcome to the Carey Nieuwhof Leadership Podcast, and I hope this next episode helps you thrive in life and leadership. And if you enjoy it, hit the like button, subscribe to my channel, that way you'll never miss a thing. So pastors, I know how difficult it can be to keep your sermons feeling fresh and relevant, especially when you're preaching week after week. So whether you're hitting a writer's block or you're in a rush because it's Friday and you're trying to put the finishing touches on your sermon, things don't always go as planned. So to help you, I've created a 10-step preaching cheat sheet. After decades of preaching, I've simplified the whole process of preparation into a series of steps and reminders that can help me and you ensure that our sermons are engaging, relevant, and memorable. Super easy to use, 10 simple prompts with examples, and you can start using it as early as this Sunday. So just go to preachingcheatsheet.com or click the link in the description. You'll get a copy sent to you for free today. Today's episode is also brought to you by compassion. Words are powerful, but as a communicator, it's far too easy to underestimate the impact of experiences. So when people experience God in a way that is outside their usual rhythms and routines, lives change. That's why I encourage you to bring a compassion experience to your church. It's an interactive way to witness the realities of life for children in poverty and the church's incredible response. Families in your community will see how the gospel is transforming lives around the world, and because not everybody can go on a mission trip, you can bring the experience to you. Compassion is currently working with the local church to release over 2.2 million children from poverty in Jesus' name, and I have personally supported them for years. To learn more, go to compassion.com/Carey, and now to today's episode. MBS, welcome back.
Carey, thank you. You're one of my favorite people to talk to, and it's so nice of you to invite me back and talk about this new book. So thank you for having me.
Well, we've had some really good times together in person, and this time we're doing this virtually just so we can get some video, that kind of thing. You sign every email, and in fact, I've got the key tag you mailed me, which is great.
Oh, I'm so glad you like that.
I want people to see this. I don't think they can. It's like buzzy. Yeah. But it says, "You're awesome, and you're doing great." Yeah. You sign every email that way whenever we chat. I smile every time we see it. I want to know, random question, why do you say that?
Well, I had a moment of spontaneity when I was facilitating a large group session. And when I'm facilitating, I'm often getting people to work in pairs or groups of 3. So they're practicing what I'm teaching them, not just hearing it. So I got people to practice a conversation. And then at the end of it, on a spur of a moment, I said, now look your partner in the eye and say this to them. You're awesome and you're doing great. And it was massively awkward. Everyone's like, oh, mumble, mumble, mumble. But I was like, I'm going to double down on this. So we had 3 or 4 more rounds of practicing. And at the end of each one, I said, you're awesome. And, turn to your partner and tell them you're awesome and you're doing great. And you could just feel this energy building in the room. And by the last one, they're like slapping hands and hugging and kind of like saying it with gusto. I'm like, there is something really powerful in this phrase. So I added it to my email signature. And the first feedback I got from that was from my mum, who was like, this is terrible. It's not grammatical. You're a Rhodes Scholar. You should at least put it grammatically. It's too American, too North American. I'm like, it is. I can't disagree with any of mum's points there. But there is something in that statement that makes people feel encouraged and seen. And, on a weekly basis, I'll get a couple of emails saying, thanks for that. I appreciated the encouragement. Because and I'm sorry to break your heart if this is what it does, Carey, but it's like, it's standard on all of my emails. It goes out to everybody.
Really?
It's just my
I'm crushed.
I know.
We talked about that offline. I love it. And now it's on a key tag.
Exactly.
And I think, nobody I've met has ever over-encouraged. Nobody's ever had a lifetime dose, right, Michael, where they're like, hey, that's enough. Can you leave me alone?
Exactly. There's no more you can help me with because I am fully charged and fully expressed and feel fully confident in every moment. I don't think that's happened yet.
Yeah, I think about it more often than reading it. You know what I mean? I'm like, oh yeah, you're awesome and you're doing great.
What I like about it is, I think it applies. It's like that famous, is it Solomon in the Bible? Oh no, I'm thinking of something else. But wanting to find a way to navigate life. And he turned to his court jester, perhaps, and as when the good times are good, I need something to help guide me, and when the bad times are bad, I need something to help guide me. And he came back with a ring with "This too shall pass" on it. And what's powerful about that phrase is it grounds you in the moment and gives you perspective. What I like about "you're awesome" and "you're doing great" is in the good times, that's helpful to hear, and in the bad times, that's helpful to hear. You're still awesome, no matter how it's going on out there. And "you're doing great" means you're probably doing the best you can, even if it's hard or even if it's easy right now.
I've never thought about "this too shall pass" in the context of the good times. I always think don't ride the highs too high and the lows too low, but you're right. It's true. You can be elated thinking, I am the best thing since sliced bread and this too will pass. Or this is the best moment, this too will pass. And also the dark clouds, this too will pass.
True. It's like reading both really good reviews and bad reviews of a book. You're like, I think, I can't remember who it was, but it was, Ray Bradbury said, you got to weigh those reviews equally, give them the same weight. Which is to give them really no weight at all is really helpful, because you just go, this is wonderful. I love that they've said this, or I'm disappointed that they've said this. And it's not really going to affect me too much in terms of the work I do or the sense of self I have.
A lot of leaders listening to this get feedback every week now, thanks to social media on whether that sermon was great, whether they're doing well as a boss, what their staff think. And it was funny because I was in Amazon. I don't go on very often. And I was checking out the reviews for my book. And, it dropped from 5 stars to like 4.7 or something like that. So it's just that it doesn't quite show 5 stars. It shows like 4.5. And I gotta be honest, that kind of like, can I just get 5 of my friends to post a 5-star review and notch it back up?
Yeah.
But how do you handle reviews? How do you handle... because you're an author who sold well over 1 million books.
Yeah.
How do you handle the 1 stars, the 2 stars?
Well, I don't take it too seriously. I love it when I hear a story of the work I do having an effect on people's lives. That's very meaningful for me. But I got an email from somebody somebody left me a voice message on LinkedIn the other day just to say, I use your work and I work in education and it's really having a ripple effect. And that's pretty wonderful to hear. But when you go into book reviews, you're like, who knows what's going on for people? I literally for The Coaching Habit, the best-selling book on coaching this century, somebody has written, this is the worst book ever written. I'm like, that's hilarious, really, because first of all, kudos to that person for reading every book ever written. And secondly, I'm quietly confident that the really bad ripoffs of The Coaching Habit are probably worse than The Coaching Habit, but maybe not. So, I with feedback generally, it's like take what's useful and ignore the rest. And so I'm like, is there anything useful here? Anything that has a grain of truth, anything that's helpful for me in my work. And if, I know the people who I care about and whose opinion about how I'm doing matters to me, and it's a pretty small number. And if I can be good in their eyes, then I have a degree of contentment that no amount of 1-star reviews on Amazon are going to drag me down too much. In part also because I'm like, this is the best I could do at the time. That book is the best I could write at the time. I gave it the best I can. I might love it or I might have some reservations about it from 2 or 5 or 7 years later on. But at the time, I did the best I could. So there's no place for regret around that.
Well, in your new book, you've got Brené Brown endorsing it on the cover, and Seth Godin and Liz Wiseman and numerous others. I think as Seth would say, well, maybe it's not for them, right?
That's right. It's like there is a way that having some skeptical or cynical reviews actually creates more credibility for the 5-star reviews.
Right.
Like if it was all...
Because otherwise you did have all of your friends go and...
Yeah, exactly. I don't have that many friends, so it wouldn't have made that much difference in the end, but who knows?
I loved our last episode that
Sure.
you and I did a couple of years ago. We kind of dove into the whole Rhodes Scholar thing, what makes you, your backstory. But I'd love to ask, what habits or practices do you have that might be a little off the beaten path that sustain you?
I'm, it's an interesting question. I'm pretty normal.
Yeah.
But I would say some of the things that characterize who I am are, I really enjoy reading, and I read diversely. So I read science, and I read business, and I read self-development, and I read young adult, and I read science fiction, and I read literature. And all of that helps me think differently and be a better writer. I think there's something rich in cross-disciplinary knowledge.
Yes,
that
I agree with that.
informs, the thing I'm working on gets most richly informed by the stuff adjacent to it, or a leap from it. And I think that might be one thing.
Hmm.
I think perhaps another, I'm not sure I guess it's a practice or kind of a commitment, is I'm very interested in trying to be a teacher, but also to decenter myself from a place of authority. And there's a really kind of weird tension around that. Like I'm not at all interested in the kind of guru status that some people in this world go for, which is like, I want to be the star. I want to have my fans. I want to have my followers. And make no mistake, I actually love being on stage. I love a spotlight. I love a crowd that I got in the palm of my hand. I love that I got some true fans who think I'm fantastic. That is all very encouraging for me. And, I wrestle with how power works in organizations. And I know that I inherited a bunch of that, both from my straight white, tall dude thing, plus being a Rhodes Scholar, plus this, plus that, plus the other. I just naturally gravitate to the center, to holding this, having the throne, being on the stage. And most of the work I'm trying to do in the end is about helping to bring forth people's humanity, but also to give people the invitation to take the responsibility and the accountability and the power that might be theirs. And so part of what it means to empower others is to give up power yourself. So I'm trying to figure out, and I haven't, this is an ongoing, I don't know how to do this exactly, but I'm trying, is to find ways to be the best teacher I can, to bring ideas into the world that spread, but also to not put me at the heart of it, but to, I'm not even sure how to say it, but be somebody who in doing that allows others to step into authority rather than necessarily me.
Yeah, and we talked about that in the last episode. We'll link to it in the show notes, but we don't have to say specifics. Another fun/unusual thing is you said, I want to stop public speaking.
Right.
This was maybe a year ago. We had dinner in Toronto or lunch or whatever. And so you set your fee at a ridiculously high
It's
level.
ridiculous, yeah.
Ridiculous, thinking, well, now I'm ungettable. Nobody's going to, and that basically killed your public speaking career. It's like, okay. And how does that, that's a very interesting way, because we're all struggling with saying no.
Yeah.
And sometimes if you just put a really strange parameter around something, yes, I will do this if you pay me X, or I will do this if A, B, C, and D are true.
Right.
And people are like, and it's not ridiculous. Like, it's not, there are people who get paid that amount of money. It's not like $1 million.
Right.
But you're like, yeah, that's like multiples of what I used to make speaking. And
That's
now most clients will just look at that and go, nah.
I can probably get somebody cheaper. And you're like, you probably can.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, I am not particularly strong-willed, and I realize that for a meaningful life, one of the most powerful things you can do is get clear on what you're saying no to. So your yeses have real weight to them. Do a few things really well. And I have shiny object syndrome. I'm constantly going, oh, I've got some ideas. Maybe I should do this. My team is like, don't get on a plane. Because on a plane, I have ideas. And I get off the plane and they're like, oh no, he's been on an 8-hour flight without internet. What's going to happen here? So rather than it coming down to my willpower to say no, I'm like, how do I set up structural things that say no for me? So, and I'm a long time coming to this, Carey. It's not like I've kind of managed this and it's all going really smoothly, but I've just had too many times where I've said, present me has said yes to a speaking gig, thinking that future me was going to love it. And when future me shows up in 6 months' time, future me is going, who made this terrible decision? Why are we here? This is not the thing you were looking for. So, we built in criteria around my speaking. So I have 5. Can you pay my full fee? Are you a friend? Is this a cool organization that I respect and I am aligned with their values and their vision? Is it an amazing location? Is it a crowd of more than 1,000 people? I think those are my 5. And they have to make 2 of those for it to be a maybe. And then the new criteria we have, well, I have 2 kind of backup criteria. One is, if this was tomorrow, would I say yes to it?
Yeah.
So that helps me manage the future me, present me confusion. And then I go and talk to Marcella, my wife, about it. Because the number of times I've come home complaining and she's like, why did you say yes? And I'm like, I'm not totally sure. So she
We've all done those events.
She's allowed to kind of say, yeah, I think that sounds like a good gig for you as well. And all of that just helps me set stuff up to not avoid the stuff that I'm both pulled towards and nervous about at the same time, the work that makes the difference.
I've never quite had this thought, but just listening to you talk about this, it's funny how you get to a certain stage in life where you just set up the boundaries that protect you from yourself.
Oh, yeah. Like I'm terrible. I have this ability to set up these ever more complicated processes and then undermine hacking my own systems. I'm like, it's a nightmare. Which often what that leaves is massively complicated systems that nobody else understands, but I have a way around them anyway. So it's a double loss. Yeah.
And categories are really, really helpful. Like I've got an email or 2 to answer this afternoon. It's like, hey, will you endorse this book? And basically in a season where I'm not doing endorsements unless you're my brother. Right. I don't have a brother. I just have sisters. So, it's pretty safe to say that is going to be a no. And I like the guy and he's writing a good book and the whole deal, but I just can't do it. I just can't do it. I've got other things on the go. And I think rules like that are very helpful. Any other rules that you've either practiced or seen that help protect people from themselves?
I use Text Expander and I just have a pre-written no. It means that I don't have to worry about how to say no. It's just, just type in semicolon NO and a short message that says, thank you so much. I really appreciate the invitation. I'm fully committed to my current projects, which means I just can't take on anything else. I wish you the best of luck, Michael. Or something like that.
Yep.
And I'm like, that saves me the emotional heartache of going, okay, I have to say no, but what will I say to this person? I'm like, it's already written. And then when there's somebody who has come to me for a book endorsement, because probably like you, I get a certain amount of people asking me, I'll either send them the no if it's there's not enough things, but if they're like my stepbrother, okay, you're not my brother, but you're my stepbrother.
Almost your brother.
So I've got some reciprocity. There's some sense of obligation on them, and I'm like, well, maybe I will email them. I've got a standard message that says, happy to take a look. My standard is if it's not a hell yes, it's a no. And often it's a no. And so most of the time I don't do the endorsement. And then I'll quickly scan the book. And if it pulls me in, then I'll write them endorsement. But often I'll go, hey, I'm thrilled for you. Well done on your book. It's such a thing to get a book written. It's not quite a fit for me, but here's a useful article I wrote about book marketing. I wish you the best of luck. And
that's a great idea.
All of that's pre-written for me. So I don't have to think too hard about what to say. I've got that set up.
And text expander shortcuts, I think, on your iPhone can do that, where basically you just have a code and then literally a paragraph or a page can appear.
Yeah.
And I think that you're so right. I would say my actual criteria, I'm joking, I don't actually have a brother. But it would be like, if I'm texting you on a weekly or regular basis,
right.
I will have a look.
Yeah.
Right now. I can think of a half dozen people who would be an exception to that rule.
Yeah.
But those people aren't writing books right now. And if they were, I'm like, okay, I can do one on a Saturday. Yeah, that's fine.
And you don't even
but I'm not
need
going
to
do 10
read,
on a Saturday.
You don't need to read much of the book. If it's that person, what you're endorsing is the person, not the book. You're like, Carey Nieuwhof is a authority and has a generous heart and a brilliant mind. This book is by Carey. You should read this book. Yeah.
Totally. Yeah, you can do that too if you know the person well.
Yeah.
Of course, cancel culture has caught up to book endorsements. So now if you endorse it, you endorse all the ideas in the book, which also means I now read a book from cover to cover before I endorse it. So
I hadn't thought of that.
I'll tell you.
Yeah. That's a lot.
Yeah. Well, church world has its blessings and its curses. Let me tell you that.
Not just the church world. There's a whole world where we're dancing with that.
We are. Well, I do want to dive into work. You've got a brand new book called How to Work with Almost Anyone. I had a privilege of reading it when it was in draft. And, before we get into the specifics, so much has changed in work in the last 5 years. So we have the rise of the gig economy, working from home, people not wanting to return to the office, the Great Resignation while it lasted. Apparently it's over now. What trends in work do you see as the most significant that we're going through right now as a culture?
I feel like I'm hanging on with my toenails and fingernails to how it's shifting and changing because, so many things are like slow, fast. We're like, it's impossible to work at home. Oh, no, it's possible. We're all working at home. Oh, we're all committed. Oh, we're not committed anymore. It's the Great Resignation. Oh, wait, it's not the Great Resignation. It's so we get a little bombarded by the flow of happening at work. But there's just generally a restlessness about the status quo and the old ways of doing things. A restlessness around what I owe an organization, whether that be a public or private or a church or whatever it might be, how power and hierarchy works. I'm a little torn about that because I grew up being that restless person and not being that great with the hierarchy and all of that sort of stuff. But now, I have an organization and I'm at the top of the organization. So there is some hierarchy. So I'm wrestling with I want people who have a commitment to my organization. So I don't have a good answer for this, Carey. I feel like all sorts of things change. There are kind of moments where we're like, oh, it's the Great Resignation moment. Oh, we're not talking about that anymore. It's diversity and inclusion, and we've got a huge focus on that. Oh, that's shifting as well. So, there's a thing called the Gartner hype chart, I think it's called, which shows how things have a hype moment and then they sink and then they kind of steady out and they find their place. And so it feels like as we hear the shifting trends in work, they're moving through the hype cycle. What I focus on and what I keep thinking about is it's kind of that Jeff Bezos insight, which is rather than what's changing, what doesn't change? Jeff Bezos will say, there's never going to come a moment where people go, I want something to be more expensive. I want it to be I want it to be delivered more slowly. So he's very focused on what he thinks are the evergreen experiences of retail. See, there are pros and cons of what Amazon have done in the world. So partly I'm like, so what hasn't changed about work? And I'm going to turn the tables on you. What do you think? As somebody who talks to people all the time because of your podcast, what do you think has remained consistent in work?
I love that framing. Well, you and Seth have both written really important books on work this year. And I would say significance, healthy relationships, a healthy culture. Am I making a difference? Is any of this doing anything. Do you see me?
Yeah.
Do I like you?
Exactly.
Can we have a conversation?
Right.
Is this work giving meaning to my life, or is it sucking my soul?
Yep.
Are you tapping into the whole of me, which
Right.
you get at, or just the part that, I'm semi-robotic now, or there's not a big difference between me and ChatGPT? I think it's those eternal issues. And I think, even as AI invades the workplace, I think it's got pros, I think it's got cons, like everything. And I'm using it, but just for a first draft or a prompt or ideas, not like to replace a job at this point. But I think it's this. I think it's meaningful conversation. I think it's being seen. I think it's being appreciated, loved, understood. Pat Lencioni built an entire career on what was almost laughed out of C-suites in the 1990s and early 2000s, which was soft skills.
Right.
And now everybody's like, no, those are the things that define a workplace, right? So I think you're right. And I think you do a beautiful job getting out of, and let's be honest about that. Was it the Gartner hype cycle?
The Gartner. So Gartner are a kind of IT consultancy.
Okay.
So Gartner, the hype cycle. And, it's like everything from, everything that's ever been invented kind of goes through that hype cycle. And most often they talk about technology, but you can map all of the kind of work trends onto that as well.
Well, and I think, right, everybody wants an edge. It's like, I coined the term great resignation, and you get your 15 minutes of fame and you're blah, 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 right? Or like, well, the great resignation is over. And so, I mean, it is good. It was prudent to pay attention to it in 2022. And then we had quiet quitting for about 3 months. Remember that? Yeah. I love that your focus is more on the timeless, not the timely. And that's why you can go back to a book, you're hinting at Ecclesiastes or Proverbs.
Yeah.
Where, written 3,000 years ago, I read a proverb every morning, and you know what? It speaks into my life. Humans don't change that much.
Right. So I go, all right, with work. I'm just going to repeat some of the stuff you said, but, my own words, which is like, how do you how do you be human in work? I do think many organizations, I know less about the church world, but you can speak to this. I think it's a nature of an organizational structure is they often tend to dehumanize people. That's the
happens at church.
Momentum. But they're like, because we're an organization, we're a structure, there's work to be done, and you kind of lose that. We're trying to get stuff done rather than we're trying to celebrate the people at the heart of the organization. That Martin Buber philosophy of I-it relationships and I-thou relationships. And I'm like, organizations will tend to I-it relationships. So people are hungry for I-thou relationships. I heard the chief innovation officer of a great place to work speaking the other day, and he said of the companies at the very top of the great place to work rankings, they are places of great listening. So people be seen and be heard, just as you said. And in the end, he said it, and in the end, it's all about the relationships. So it is about this sense of, do I have relationships? Are there people who, they don't have to be my best friend, but do I feel like I have a degree of kind of connection and alignment with them? Am I making progress? Am I making progress on work that matters a little bit? And if you can do all of that, you're doing marvelously, because that is simple to say and it's hard to pull off.
Thanks for raising Buber. I haven't thought about him in many, many years, maybe since seminary. So you're right. But it's
beautiful.
the people
I love
skills.
It. Yeah.
Yeah. So let's talk about, let's jump right into how to work with almost anyone. Okay. So I think we all have the experience. It's like, well, I really have a best friend at work, or I can get along with this person, or we socialize off hours. But there's almost always, you only need a team of 4, 5, 6 people to have someone that you're like, yeah, not so sure about that person, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. And then you get into a large organization, and inevitably there are coworkers that you just don't like.
Right.
And you don't want to work with, or like, I have an insufferable boss.
Yeah.
So what is a big idea behind how to work with almost anyone?
Yeah. The big idea is every working relationship can be better. And that matters because your happiness and your success depends on your working relationships.
Hmm.
Most of the time, we cross our fingers and we hope for the best. You're like, I hope there's fewer of those people who I don't like very much. I hope there's more of those people who I really get on with and we click and it's magical. There's a honeymoon period that lasts somewhere between 12 seconds and 12 weeks. But we're like, how do I more actively shape the working relationships, knowing that they're so important to not just the work that gets done, but to my own sense of well-being, my own sense of being seen, my own sense of being human with people around me.
Hmm.
And the best possible relationship is an idea that isn't just about, so how do we turn every working relationship into a thing of, Disney-esque magic and beauty with unicorns and, sprites jumping around. I always go, look, your working relationships are probably mappable on a bell curve, past and present. You will have some at one end where you're like, this is great. We just clicked. It was fun. We elevated each other. We danced through the hard stuff. We had some grace. We had some style. We had some fun. Those kind of magical working relationships. People can probably call a face or a name to mind right away. There are probably some people down the other end of the bell curve where you're like, wow, that was hard. That was a bit miserable. Sometimes you're like, and that person was the incarnation of evil, but quite often it's actually much more mundane than that. It's like there was sand in the gears. We could just not find a way of kind of clicking and getting going. It was just hard work. Most of the other people, often quite forgettable in some ways, they're kind of right in the middle somewhere. They're like, it was okay. And with best possible relationship, you're like, okay, not only how do you make the really great ones even more magical and last even longer, or that's a really great outcome. It's not even about taking the ones in the middle and going, how do you give a bit more magic to those? But it's that as well. How do you bring out the best of each other, even on those more standard relationships? It's also, look at those really hard-working relationships right now. What if you could make those workable or bearable or good enough? What if you could make a difference there? There's a writer on relationships called John Gottman, wrote one of the really influential books on this I think it's called The 7 Secrets of a Successful Marriage. And amongst other things, he says that the issues in a relationship, 70% of those are perpetual. Like they're just going to be there.
The 10-year argument.
Yeah, exactly. You're like that. If you look forward to that argument for the rest of your life, because that's the way it's going to roll. But
I say this and she says this. And, yep.
The optimism for me in that is it's like, that means 30% of the relationship you can influence. What if you could make the bad and the good and the brilliant working relationships 30% better? What would that be like? What would that do to your success and to your happiness? And then the rest of the book is like, okay, if you buy into that as an idea that all working relationships can be better and it matters because that drives success and happiness, how do you do that? And that's what we get into in the book.
So I want to get into some of the specifics, but let me name the elephant in the room, because there are people listening right now who are like, yeah, but you got to meet my boss. You got to meet this one. Like the almost is in brackets, Michael. So if you have a totally toxic boss, where is the line? Because I think we all intuitively know that, okay, there might be a couple of people who are impossible, but we can probably turn some of the C minuses or D pluses into a B.
Yeah.
If we work at it. Do you draw the line? Where do you draw the line if you draw the line about toxicity or that really difficult person?
I'm not sure. It's a big, complex question because it depends so much on you and context and them and tenure and just what their behaviors are like. I mean, when I came up with the title, How to Work with Almost Anyone, I'm like, oh, that is a great title, because everybody immediately goes, oh, let me tell you about my almost. I know exactly who that person is.
Exactly.
But I'm like, okay, name your almost person. That leaves everybody else. And what I hope is that you don't just assume that every difficult or challenging or not straightforward working relationship is irredeemable. You go, okay, Carey, good guy-ish, but he and I, we don't really click that well. I probably won't bother because it's too much. It's too much at risk. But
Right.
but I could also go, look, Carey, we don't click. He and I don't click when we're working together. But I don't think it's toxic. I just think we've got different styles of working, and we haven't
Right.
figured it out yet. And I might come into a conversation with Carey, maybe you, maybe a different Carey, and go, right, if I can make this a little bit better for us, that's going to
Mhm.
reduce the impact quite a lot in terms of the misery or the kind of het upness that I get around that working relationship. So for sure, there are some relationships where I'm like, that person is a psychopath. There's all that good research that says psychopaths are 1% in the population and 20% of CEOs, or maybe it's 13% of CEOs.
Mm.
There's a way that that type of person definitely shows up in organizations. And there may be other people where you're like, this is never going to get better and it's not worth it. But the way I look at it, this, Carey, if you look at a relationship, a key relationship, one that influences your happiness and success, you've got two choices: to have a conversation and try and make it better, or to not have a conversation. And each choice has prizes and punishments, has risk and
Mm.
reward. And it's worth just looking at both of those choices and actually sitting with what's at risk and what might get better. And
Mm.
then make the call around that rather than just going, they're toxic, they're too hard, too difficult, I give up.
I really appreciate that angle. My wife used to work as a divorce attorney, and one of her conclusions after working with hundreds of couples was she realized that, yeah, there is that odd, super toxic, abusive person that you need
Yeah.
to take a break from. But there were numerous times where the problems were not that big. And she had a few clients sit in her office after it was all over. And she was into mediation and, staying out of court and the whole deal. Um, Very conciliatory. And they would say, you know what, if I knew it was going to be this hard, I would have tried harder.
Yeah.
And I think that's a very similar vibe. You're right. So maybe for the purposes of this conversation, take the most toxic person in your life out of it right now. The person who really does have some kind of borderline personality disorder or is a complete narcissist or whatever. And let's focus on the almost everyone else. So with that in mind, how do you work with almost anyone?
Well, the idea at the heart of the book is singular. It is this: have a conversation about how you work together before you plunge into the conversations manifold of what you're working on. And that conversation about what to do, what are we working on, what's the problem, is the loud thing. It feels the thing that you
Mhm.
want to talk about right from the start because it's there, it's urgent, it's exciting, it's troublesome, it's worrisome,
Mhm.
it's calling you. I mean, even when you think back on the Coaching Habit book, Carey, which is the book of mine that's been most successful by a long way. One of the first questions there is, what's the real challenge here for you? That's a
Yeah.
great question, but it's a question about the issue. It's a
Mm.
question about the work. And I'm saying, if you take your eyes off the work and look the other person in the eye, metaphorically or literally, and say, before we get onto all of that stuff, which is calling us and needs to be sorted out, what if you and I have a chat about how we best work together so that when we work together to solve it, we're bringing out our best and we're avoiding our worst to get going on the stuff that matters?
Hmm. You call that the Keystone Conversation? Is that
Do.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It works as a metaphor twice. One for the keystone that people probably come to mind immediately, which is, the
Mm.
big stone in the middle of the pillars of an arch. And I was like, that's a great metaphor because it's, two pillars and they lean towards each other. And then the keystone joins them and creates stability and strength. And the longer it's there, the more solid it becomes. It works really nicely as that kind of metaphor. But in the 80s, this idea of a keystone was taken into order of ecology and biology. And they started talking about keystone species in an ecosystem. The best
Hmm.
story being the introduction of wolves into Yellowstone National Park in the
Right.
US.
Quite controversial. Yeah.
Controversial, but basically, wolves had been shot and made extinct. Elk had overrun the park and were kind of slowly destroying the park because there were too many elk and they were eating all the trees and eating all the vegetation and everything was kind of getting denuded and stripped bare. Reintroducing the wolves brought the elk population under control, scared them out of some areas, which meant that the vegetation came back, which meant the river got healthier, which meant the beavers came back, more fish, more birds, and the whole ecosystem became more diverse, more rich, more resilient, better able to bear stress. So whether you're up for the building metaphor or the ecology metaphor, that keystone idea is this is the thing that shapes and allows the ecosystem, which could be your relationship, to be stronger, to last longer, and to bear stress.
Yeah, and it's funny how a predator can make things better. That's a really interesting thought. Something to just tuck away. I'm just going to put a pin in that. I don't know that we can do anything with that today. Predators make things better. Okay. So you're going to have the conversation. Can you walk us through what that would look like? So it's how do we work together, not what are we going to do? Because often you're right. Okay, job one around here is boom, 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 boom. Here's our value statement. Here's our culture. All right, now let's get on to the task. You've got two, A, B, C, D. So before you do that, walk us through the broad overview of the conversation you want to have.
Yeah. So there's three main parts to the conversation. One is you do a bit of preparation. One is you invite somebody in and you have the conversation. And after you've had the conversation, there's kind of ongoing maintenance of the working relationship. That's the big picture. And then for the conversation itself, which is kind of what the book is mostly written around, I suggest 5 potential questions that you can walk through. And I think you can do it, all 5 questions, one after the other. But I do just want to flag for people that if they just sit down, like even if you never buy the book and you don't even listen to what the questions are, you just sit down and you go, hey, why don't we have a conversation about how we work together so that we bring out our best? So how do I bring out your best? And how do you bring out my best? And how do I avoid your worst? And how do you avoid my worst? If that's all you're taking from this conversation, that's brilliant, because that's the essence of it. Now, I do have 5 more specific questions to ask and answer if that's helpful for you, but don't get daunted by 5 questions. Just go, it's a conversation about how we work together is what makes all the difference.
Okay, well, let's break that down. So the big meta question is, what's your best and what's your worst? What gets revealed in that? What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so the first question is the amplify question, and I framed it as what's your best? And when I was writing the book, Carey, I was like, okay, how do I, what's the question here? I knew it was something about focusing on the light. In the world of change management, there are things like appreciative inquiry or positive deviance or appreciative intelligence. It's this idea of amplify what's working rather than fret about what's not working. I'm like, that's powerful. But I didn't want to ask, what are you good at? Too limiting. I didn't want to ask what your strengths are. Too abstract. Didn't want to ask what your values were. Also too abstract. I wanted to get a picture of when this person was in their sweet spot. So the way to think about this first question, what's your best, is when do you shine and when do you flow? So this idea of the flow state from Mikhail Csikszentmihalyi, the Hungarian psychologist, very long, complicated name, which I've had to memorize in terms of pronouncing it. This idea that when you can get into that flow state and you've got the perfect work and you're kind of lit up and your time speeds up and slows down, what's that? Tell me about that. What's the work that lights you up? And what's the type of working relationships with people? When are you at your best with that? Is it with people? Is it not with people? Is it working in a certain way with people? What does that look like? And what's kind of essential to who you are? And I want you to paint that picture for me, because if I get that understanding of what you are at your best, I'm like, first of all, I'm seeing it. Even as you tell me the answers to this, you're lighting up around it. And I'm like, I want more of that. And hopefully when you tell your answers as well, they do the same. They're like, okay, how do we get more of this more often between the two of us? So it's a really strong start, which is, this is what it looks like when each of us individually are showing up at our best. Can you imagine how well we're going to work together if we can get more of that between us more of the time?
And then do you go to what's your worst? Like what's a great day? What's a bad day? What's a great flow? What's the opposite of flow?
I wait a little bit later than that to kind of formally ask that. But here's the thing. typically when you ask this question, the invitation is to then be curious. So when they tell you, you don't have to go, okay, noted, write something down and don't ask another question. You're like, tell me more about, I'm really interested in, what happens if, and you can get really curious about that. And this curiosity, which is in service of the other person, helping them understand themselves and you to understand that other person, such a gift. And so here you are going, look, I want to understand more about this. So, be nosy, be curious as people give you their answers, because unclear what you'll uncover, but you're going to uncover some interesting stuff.
And you raised such a great question last time we talked. I think it was in a previous book. What's on your mind and what else? That's such a great follow-up question. And what else? Yeah. I've used that so many times since our first conversation.
Yeah.
And it's funny because people tell you, and then you go, and what else? And then it's like, well, actually, boom, boom, boom. And then it's so clarifying. So if you want a question to stick in your pocket, that's super easy to remember. Just when someone gives the initial answer, just say, and what else?
Here's the way to remember that, perhaps. Their first answer is never their only answer, and it's rarely their best answer. So if you know that, it just gives you an obligation to go, great, we've only just got started here. And what's miraculous about asking and what else, Carey, is most of the time people don't even hear you ask it. All they hear is you holding the space for them to tell you more, longer. And
I've never had anybody go, excuse me, what? Like, it's such an easy question, and they always answer it because there's always some. I've never had someone say nothing.
Well, I have. I've had people go, I don't have anything else. And you know what's wonderful about that? That's not a failure. That's a success. You go, great.
It's all out on the table.
That's perfect. Let me ask you a different question then. Yeah.
Okay, so you said there were 5 more.
Yeah, so the second question.
The 5?
The second question is the steady question. And this is like, what are your practices and preferences? Because we all have mechanics and logistics of how we show up and how we work. And they all feel like common sense to us. And they're not. They're our own quirky work habits that we've developed over time. Everything from how you file things, what you name things, what you like to be called. I mean, on a very practical level, like my name is Michael Bungay Stanier. It is a complicated name, more complicated than I would have expected, but so be it. Because when I got married, I took my wife's name and so added Bungay to Stanier, but we didn't put a hyphen in there. So there's like this invisible hyphen. So people get my name wrong all the time. People are scared about how to say my name. Like I have literally incorporated my company as the Banging Spaniel Company because I once got a letter to Michael Banging Spaniel. And I was like, that's too good to pass up. I don't like to be called Mike. I like to be called Michael. And one of the things that I've been learning in the last little while is people want to be clear about what their pronouns are. I'm like, wow, I wouldn't have guessed that 10 years ago. 10 years ago, we just had, the pronouns were obvious. You didn't have to declare them. But like now I want to know what people's pronouns are because it's not something that I worry about particularly, but I want them to be seen and I want them to be heard. And if they want to be called them rather than he, then I will accommodate that. So it's everything from how you Slack, what meetings are, how you prefer your feedback. Like I work with somebody at the moment and she and I have different preferences around how we give each other feedback. For me, I'm like, please just be as blunt as possible. Like I'm a bit obtuse. So it's really helpful if you kind of like hit me over the head with it. And I also have a really good self-esteem. So you don't have to worry about hurting my feelings because you can just lay it on me and I'm not going to take it too personally. Just feedback. Take what's useful, ignore the rest. For her, she's like, I'm really hungry for feedback. And there are times I'm a little fragile because I've had some pretty rough experiences of that with other people and other organizations. So here's how I like you to lead into feedback. So I can just get my feet from underneath me and I can just get myself ready to hear what needs to be said. She's still hungry for it. She just needs a slower lead into it where I'm like, accelerate, please. That's the sort of
And what is
conversation.
that question? What is that question again?
The question is, what are your practices and what are your preferences?
Practices and preferences.
Yeah.
Got it. Super helpful. Excellent. And I can see that. Yeah. Okay. Third?
The third and the fourth question, they kind of work together. They're the good date question and the bad date question. So they're the flip sides of the same coin. And the key inside here, Carey, is your patterns repeat. So what happened in the past is going to happen again in the future. Doesn't matter that the past was a different church and a different congregation and a different group of people and you were younger and more naive or any of that stuff. It's just going to keep showing up. So why not understand what those patterns are and be able to articulate them? So start with, when you've had a really successful relationship in the past, what can we learn from that? What did the other person do and say and also not do and not say? And what did you do and say and not do and not say? Tell that story, because that's going to make a really good working relationship come to life for the person you're in conversation with. And do the same for those frustrating past relationships. Tell me about a relationship that drove you nuts. What was that like? What got done and not done, said and not said? And tell that story so the person can go, oh, I'm getting it. This is the thing we shouldn't try and create here. I think it's really powerful, Carey, for the frustrating past relationship. The temptation is to complain about the other person because, they're an easy target. They were messy,
my terrible
nightmare,
boss.
Napoleonic, kind of whatever, status hungry, power hungry, selfish. You can kind of get into a bit of a complaining mode around that. I think it can be really powerful in a way that can be kind to you, compassionate to who you are, to go, here's how I contributed to that bad relationship. Because you did contribute. It wasn't 100% on them and 0% on you.
Yeah. Fair.
Find your way of saying, this is what I own in that dysfunction.
It's like when someone complains about their ex, it's like, I don't know, and he was or she was. And it's like, did you play a role in that? I thought you might have. Yeah.
And even if it's 100% true what they're saying about that other person, it's kind of like, so what between you and me? Like, they're nothing to do with me. It's you and me here. So I'm just interested in how you show up. And sure, I'm interested in what I should avoid doing because you're telling me some of that. But I'm really interested to go, oh, you are unwilling to call me on my BS if I'm doing that. And that's really helpful to hear because there are times where I can go off and I can be full of myself and I need to be called on it. And then, because this is all about sparking curiosity, you're like, so this is a conversation we've got to negotiate.
Yeah.
I'll give you another
good
example.
Day, bad day?
Well, let me give you one more example of that and then we'll come to the fifth question. I had this conversation with a vendor the other day. So somebody who was helping me with some website stuff. And in a kind of a slightly more low-key way, we were in our first conversation and they were like, let's talk about the website. And I'm like, great, but before the website, tell me when you had a client that you've loved. What was that like? What do they do? And when you've had some really bad clients, what did they do? And I'm going to tell you about the best vendors that I work with, the ones that I love and I give lots of business to. And then I'm going to tell you about the ones where we did one project and I'm like, great, we're done. Bye. And I won't ever call you again. And one of the things that came up is that we really like vendors who are responsive to our stuff. It's like, our clients who are responsive. So when they send them something, we'll get a reply within 48 hours. And I'm like, so I'm sometimes called the VP of bottlenecking because if I'm not responsive, I'm very unresponsive. So we then had a conversation about how to manage me when I'm behaving badly. And that is really healthy because we both now know what's going on and they're now able to call me on it in a way that we've given each other permission on it.
That's really good. Very astute. I wonder how often a vendor would have a conversation like that. 1 in 1,000, 1 in 10,000? Like, it's probably pretty rare.
By the look of shock on their eyes when I ask them this question, you're going to go, oh my goodness, what are our answers to that? Not that often. And
Yeah.
that's part of the reasons why it can be really helpful to give people a little bit of a heads up that you're going to get into a conversation around this. So you're like, look, I'm looking forward to our kickoff conversation. I want to talk about the project in the brief. I want to start off by checking in with you about what a really good client-vendor relationship is going to look like. So I want you to think about what a great client is, and I'm going to tell you what a great vendor is for me. And we can set things up by starting there.
It's interesting because that also, on the part of the person initiating the conversation, requires a fair degree of self-awareness.
That's true.
So, as you said, you're not as young and naive and blah, 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 blah. But like I had an example this morning where I was working on what was supposed to be a 3-minute routine task. And I clicked through to an article that was going out by email. I'm like, wait a minute, this isn't right. It had been completely rewritten in someone else's name. And they had taken my words. Now, we use a variety of firms, and it could have happened a bunch of different ways. But this is 7 a.m. Nobody else is at work. So I'm not going to start texting and calling people at 7 a.m. But, it reminded me, I don't like surprises.
Right.
And I was totally surprised by that. And I think when I'm 82 years old, I'm still not going to like surprises.
That's right.
Particularly if it's not a good surprise.
Yeah.
So, I fixed the article and got the byline right and found some of my original language. And it's like, this is on my blog. I want it to sound like me. Who rewrote this?
Yeah.
Blah, 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 blah. And then I'm like, yeah, that hasn't changed. I'm much more modulated. I'm much more I have a lot more self-control than I used to.
Right.
But that's still true. But you need that level of self-awareness to walk into a conversation with.
Yeah. And so, honestly, this book is a business book that disguises a bit of a self-help book. So each of the 5 questions has 3 exercises associated with it to help deepen your self-knowledge and refine your language and make your answers both more nuanced and more granular at the same time. I'm trying to give people the vocabulary to say, let me give you some subtle and useful answers to these questions, not just the kind of high-level jazz hands type of answers, which will be your initial answers to that.
Right. Okay, question 5.
Question 5, the repair question. How will we fix it when things go wrong? And the power of this, Carey, is you're saying things are going to go wrong. Not, on the off chance things will go wrong. It's like, it always goes wrong. Something always goes off the rails. Sometimes it's big and kind of explosive and kind of catastrophic, but mostly not. Mostly it's a dent, a crack, a rip in the fabric. Something happens, a misspoken word, a misunderstood expectation, a broken promise. There's all sorts of ways that us messy, complicated human beings get the other messy, complicated human being wrong somehow. So this opens up a conversation about what does it look like when it goes wrong, and how do you fix it, and how do I fix it? But what it really does is it says we have permission to talk about it when it goes wrong. We have permission and a shared commitment to try and repair it when it goes wrong.
That's super helpful. Now, what else? Anything else about the 5 questions, the principles that we haven't covered that you'd like to cover?
Well, Carey, I think you've brought up something really important. I just want to say it again so people hear it. The "and what else" question from the coaching habit and the advice trap, so helpful in this conversation. And at the same time, the real win in this keystone conversation is actually not so much the answers that you're hearing, although that's particularly helpful. It is the fact that you have started to make and normalize the fact that you're talking about the working relationship and the health of the working relationship. So you now have permission to keep checking in with each other. Hey, how are we doing? How are you doing? How am I doing? What do we need to do more of or less of or double down on to make this the best possible working relationship? You get to keep checking in on the health of that. I saw a statistic the other day that said 70% of Gen Z workers leave their first job within a year. I know, it's like mind-blowing. And I suspect it's a significant part of that is that well-known saying, people join organizations, but they leave managers. And you don't want to have that manager, but you definitely don't want to be that manager. So what this does is, first of all, it helps you not be that manager. Secondly, it says it is our joint responsibility to try and build the best possible relationship here. It's not just on me. It's not just on you. But how do we do this together?
On that note, do you notice any generational differences when you roll out this concept and see people practice it? Because innately, I would assume a boomer might respond differently to even this premise than, say, a Gen Z. And to be fair to all generations, I think for a lot of people, it'll be the first time they've ever had this conversation in their life. Kind of like when you ask the vendor, like, what makes for a good client? What makes for a bad client? What makes for a good vendor? They're like, what are you even talking about? Like, they talk about it in the break room. They talk about it, amongst themselves, but they've never had that conversation publicly. So I think it's new. And do you notice generational changes?
I definitely notice that people who are in the early phase of their career are just less articulate about what they want because they're still figuring it out. They're kind of more idealistic and more naive and more unrealistic. And I'm like, yep, that's me as well. That was exactly what I was like when I was that age. And there's, now that I'm kind of getting on, I'm like, I feel slightly paternalistic about it and slightly irritated by it and slightly encouraged by it in kind of equal doses. So I do think that part of why you're doing this is to actually help people find the language and start thinking about this. And you're moving them to emotion. This is a form of emotional intelligence. And an emotional intelligence can get learned and refined. And so you're building capacity in people to go, oh, I'm learning. I hadn't even thought about that before. But I'm finding words that tell me about that. And it kind of ties back to the last question in the Coaching Habit series, which is, what was most useful or most valuable here for you? Part of why that's so powerful to ask when you're in conversation with people is it stops and it says, learn from this conversation. What are you taking away? What are you noticing about you? What are you noticing about this conversation? Become smarter. I think this is the job as as somebody who looks after people in an organization, call it whatever you want, manager or a leader or a role in a church hierarchy. You're like, I'm a teacher. I'm trying to teach people who they are so they build their confidence and their capacity and their sense of who the best of them are. And when you ask, what was most useful or most valuable here for you in this conversation, you're helping them learn. When you check in regularly and go, how are we doing? What are you learning about you and how you work? What needs to be said that hasn't yet been said in terms of this working relationship? You're asking them to be smarter about who they are. You're helping them give them language about who they are.
This has been so helpful, and thank you. In both of these conversations you and I have had, I feel like I've grown as a leader. I've got to execute on this stuff, but it's super helpful. Michael, is there anything else that you want to cover before we wrap up?
I might just say that the Keystone conversation isn't the end of it. It's in some ways the start of it.
Right.
It'd be kind of nice if it was a one and done thing. Oh, we had a conversation 4 years ago about how to work together. That's fine. But if you're in a more intimate relationship, you know how well that works. We talked about how we were doing 4 years ago. We're just carrying on. Then it doesn't work. So I have a kind of 3-part theory around maintenance. It is to adjust always. So you're checking in and going, do we need to tap the tiller at all? It's to repair often. Keep checking and going, have I missed anything? Is there something where we've slightly ripped that we need to kind of fix? And it's to reset as needed, because there are times where you're like, we need to stop this, or we need to really kind of blow it up and start it again because we need a reset to make this really work.
Wow. Okay. Super helpful. Well, thanks, MBS. The book is called How to Work with Almost Anyone.
Thanks for holding it up.
And it's available widely. Is there a special website or anything
there is
that people should go to?
bestpossiblerelationship.com. And there are downloads there. There's also a video of me doing a keystone conversation with Ainsley on my team. Ainsley and I have been working together for 4 years, but she's just been promoted into a new senior role. And so we're using that as a way of kind of reaffirming how we work with each other, but also resetting how we want to work with each other as she moves to this more senior, greater responsibility. So you can kind of see it in action.
Great. And you're pretty active on Instagram. I follow you. So
Thank you.
What's your handle on Instagram?
It's at MBS_works.
There you go. Till next time. Thanks so much,
sir.
MBS.
It's my pleasure. It's a great delight.